Want insight, encouragement, and the truth about writing, speaking, and creating? Welcome to For Writers and Speakers, the Called Creatives podcast with myself, Lisa Whittle, and Ally Worthington. Today's guest is the incredible Ally Fallon, expert publishing coach and author. You're going to love this one, so let's dive in. I'm really excited to have the founder of Find Your Voice, award-winning author and expert publishing coach with a new book out, Write Your Story, a simple framework to understand yourself, your story, and your purpose in the world. Ally Fallon is here on For Writers and Speakers, the Called Creatives podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, it's exciting. Ally's not here today, so it is just me, and I'm super excited to talk to you about all kinds of things. You've written 13 books. Were 13 books on your list of, I think I'm going to do this in my life, or was this just kind of what happened?
So it's a little bit of both. I always knew that I wanted to be an author. I can remember thinking as young as 10 years old that I wanted to write books when I grew up. So I always kind of knew that that was my trajectory. But one of the things that happened after I published my first book is I realized that it was going to be really hard to generate a full-time income selling a $20 product, especially when you're partnering with a publisher and the percentage that you're taking is small. So you really have to move a lot of products if you're going to make a full-time income, making $1 or whatever or less off of each book you sell.
Yeah.
So one of the ways that I generated an income for myself was by writing books for other people or partnering with people and helping them execute on the writing process. So a lot of the books that I've written have been ghostwritten. They're not actually my books. I've written this book that's coming out now will be the fourth book that I've written that has my name on it. And then the rest of them have all been for other people. So I didn't see that part of it coming, but I definitely did see the writing piece coming.
But I love that you include, I guess this makes perfect sense, but I think some people don't understand what happens when you ghostwrite books or when you write books that have your name on it. I love that you include all the books that you've written, whether or not they do have your name on it, because that is still a book that you've written. I do think people don't completely understand ghostwriting process. Anything you want to say about how different it is when you have your name on the front of a book versus when you write a book for someone else? Does it feel different? That's not something I've ever done. So does it feel different? And is there any less or more pride in it? I don't know. Tell us a little bit about that.
It feels really different. The biggest thing that feels different is because the stories you're sharing aren't your own. You don't have a horse in the race in the same kind of way. So your own insecurities or vulnerabilities or imposter syndrome doesn't get in the way as easily as it does when it's a book that has your name on it, which is actually helpful because when that piece of it is removed, what you get to focus on is 100% the tactical side of writing. That's really what you bring to the table as a ghostwriter is the ability to execute on the tactical part of writing that this author can't do for any number of reasons. Sometimes it's just literally they can't do it because they don't have the days or the hours in their day. Yeah. Sometimes it's because the writer has a skill set that the author of the book doesn't have. But either way, that collaborative process allows you as the writer to disengage from the part of book writing where you're just like, oh gosh, what's my mom going to think when she reads this story, or what's my brother going to think when I say this thing about him? And focus on the tactical side of it. What's going to be most interesting for a reader? How do I hook a person into this story? How do I really make this land for the reader? Or, how do I really drive this point home? What's fun about that is I was probably, 5 years or so into the ghostwriting part of my journey when I found myself in a conversation with a colleague of mine, and I was kind of not complaining, but I was just like, oh, I'm spending all my creative energy, doing this writing for other people when I really came here because I wanted to do this for myself. When will my time ever come? That sort of thing. And this person said to me very wisely, he was like, I want you to think about this like you're getting paid to get a master's degree in writing books right now. So you're becoming the world's expert on what it means to write a book and what it takes to write a book without having to have each of those books have your name on it. So what a gift that's been given to you. And I'm so grateful for his perspective on that. I think that's helpful for any creative person who feels like, oh, I'm stuck in this rut. I'm doing this creative stuff for other people, but I'm not doing it for myself. Just to remind yourself that everything that you generate for a client is practice. So, this book is really my 14th book, even though it's only my fourth book that other people know about.
I think that's so good. I would also say that's a good word for like an intern or someone who is doing some kind of other work for someone else that maybe you feel like you don't get the credit for sometimes. It's all like deposits in your career. So super good word. I could talk to you about a lot about all that, but I got to keep going here. I think something that people struggle with a lot is being able to say the words, I'm a writer. Like that seems like such a hurdle. And let me not be so far removed from it. I think there was absolutely a period of time in my life where saying those words, I'm a writer, it was really hard to come out of my own mouth.
Yeah.
So do you remember the point in your career where you were able to say for the first time, I'm a writer?
You know what's weird is I feel like I'm a weirdo on this front. I'm definitely outside of the box because I didn't struggle as much with calling myself a writer. I can remember being really, really young and journaling, writing poetry, writing prose, putting essays together, and feeling like I owned the identity of writer from a really young age. I've definitely have imposter syndrome in a lot of things in my life and I struggle with like being an entrepreneur, being a business owner, that sort of thing. Like I'll always say, like I'm not good at marketing, and my team is like, stop, you can't say that. You are good at marketing. You have a lot of experience in this, But I do want to say that I've worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of authors over the course of my career. And a lot of people who you would assume, of course, they're a writer. They're a shoo-in as a writer. They still have this same insecurity and this same inner block. Like this is not a client who I've worked with, but just as an example, I went to a book reading when Diane Keaton released her memoir. And she was talking in a conversation with her editor as part of this book release thing. I went to this conversation that she had with her editor, and her editor was saying how she showed up to their first meeting together, and he was saying like, okay, well, here's what the book is going to be about, and here's what we'd love to hear from you and whatever. And she was like, she lifted like this giant stack of notebooks that she had written about her life inside of these notebooks and kind of set them on the table and was like, you need to know I'm not a writer. Like I'm not a real writer. And he was like, wait, hold on. But you just put the dichotomy of this giant stack of books where she had written about her story and her saying, I'm not a writer, that's like, it's the perfect image of every author I've ever worked with. People who have published multiple books, who have sold hundreds of thousands or even millions of copies of their book will say to me, I'm not a writer. And I'm just like, how can you say that? And they'll be like, well, this was an accident. Like I shouldn't have done this. My original career was X. And I just kind of stumbled into this by accident. And so here's this book that I have. And I always share that to remind people that the very insecurities that you're struggling with, the authors who you love and look up to, they also have that internal dialogue that says, I couldn't possibly do this thing. One other thing that's important to say, this insecurity specifically as it relates to writing, the communication of process of writing, I think is you can trace it back through our lineage. The act of writing was for the elite. Only the elite, you go back 1,000 years, only the elite were taught how to read and write.
Yes.
And so this feeling like only certain people should be allowed to do this is in our heritage. It's in our lineage. It's in our DNA.
Yeah.
And I think I'm of the belief that it's so important that we continually break this generational cycle that we're in, where we believe like only the small group of people are worthy of putting their words down on the page. I believe that there's a much bigger spiritual and historical thing at play right now, that every person who steps into their power as a writer and says, I am a writer, I do have a story to tell. My experience belongs on the page. My experience belongs in a bookstore. Every person who does that is part of breaking that generational curse. And that we're moving into a time where many more experiences are being represented and where we are going to get a much fuller and clearer picture of history. And I think that's really important sociologically, spiritually, on all sides.
Yes. I'm so glad you brought this aspect of the conversation into it, because what I was thinking as we were talking about this idea of not being able to utter the words, I'm a writer, was the worthiness aspect of it. It does seem to have this accompaniment of like waiting on a feeling of worthiness to be able to say that. And so I'm really glad you brought this into it, because it's one of the main reasons that Alli and I started Called Creatives Publishing, because watching women in particular be waiting to be chosen year after
Yes.
year, who literally would have this incredible story to tell. I'm book coaching a woman right now whose story is so incredible, but also her turn of words, like she's always throwing me for a loop. And so every time I read her work, I'm like, how has this woman been on the planet for 62 years and we've never gotten to read her work? But I know because of platform size and all the things that go into traditional publishing, like this woman is waiting to be chosen. And so I love the fact that now we live in this place that we have hybrid options, we have self options where no one has to wait to be chosen to be published anymore. And so there's something so powerful about that. And so I'm so glad you brought this in, besides the fact that you brought in Diane Keaton, who's one of my very favorites. So that's already a favorite of mine right here. Tell me if you agree with this or not. And we can disagree, by the way. I'm all up for those kinds of spry arguments here. But I have this philosophy of writing, and I think while there are some absolute non-negotiables of a writing process that makes it really robust. You're a book coach. I'm a book coach. I think there's some things that I would say non-negotiables across the board that is really important for a good writing process. I feel like beyond that, everybody's process is a little bit different. So one of the things that I struggle with when people will say, well, tell me how I need to write in this way. I say, like, this is what works for me, but it might not work for you. First, do you agree with my philosophy on that? And then tell me, what is your writing process?
I agree with you 100%. I teach people when I'm working with them to write a book or to work on a writing project to pay attention to their own habits and rituals. We have these habits and rituals in place sometimes without even realizing it. For example, maybe before you sit down to write, maybe you clear your space. This is something that I do before I write. Like I will do the dishes. It's almost like I can't not do it. I have to do the dishes, light a candle, clear the space, wipe the surface, then I can sit down and write. Then I feel ready. So when you pay attention to the things that you're already intuitively doing before you write, you can start to get a sense of what is required for you to access that space in your brain where good writing comes from. For me, like I mentioned, one of the things that I do is clear my space. Another thing that I catch myself doing is doing something to get my heart rate up. So I'll go for a long walk, or I'll go to a yoga class, or I'll go to the gym and get on the treadmill for a little bit. There's a lot of data actually that backs this up, that getting your heart rate up helps you to access that part of your brain, the creative part of your brain. But the nice part about this is when you start to notice those habits and rituals that help you get into that space, you can sort of sidestep them and hack them if you need to. If I only have time to do one thing, either go to the gym or sit down and write, and I really want to get my writing done today, I can do some jumping jacks or push-ups or something next to my computer really quickly to shorten that time so I still get my heart rate up. I can still sit down to my computer and do the thing. And I don't have to, have this 3-hour ritual to get into my writing. Because especially now that I have kids, before I had kids, there was endless white space in my day. So I could do whatever I needed to do to get into my creative space. And now sometimes it's you've got 25 minutes, ready, go. You got to get, your writing done for the day. So something else that I'll do, just knowing how my brain works and knowing my own habits and patterns, is I will go into a room to write instead of sitting in the kitchen, because this is usually in my kitchen living room area where I like to sit to write. But if I don't have a lot of time to completely clear this space, I'll go into a room that's already cleared and light my candle in there. And that works too. It's a way to sort of hop, skip, and jump over that part of the process. What happens when you pay close attention to the things you're already doing that are working is it helps you to be able to hone in on those things and use them to your advantage.
I love that. That's really, really good. I was doing a training for our Called Creatives community, and it was on speaking. Actually, I was doing one on writing a speaking template, and I came across some statistics, but of course, one of the ones that I had to pay a little bit closer attention to, knowing I was going to speak with you, was this one where researchers say that in a speech, people only remember one thing, if anything, which already knew that piece of it. But the one thing that people usually remember in a speech is a story. And that makes perfect sense to me, right? I mean, because actually, as I'm recalling sitting and hearing hundreds of thousands of speeches. I grew up a pastor's daughter, so I've heard hundreds of thousands of sermons, all of that. Stories are what are always compel us. It's one of the reasons I love your book, Write Your Story, because you are compelling us towards writing our story, whether we are a contracted author or not, but certainly the people that are listening to this podcast, this is exactly for you. And so there are a couple of things that I want to talk to you about that you talk about in your book and just are so rich for this conversation here. One of the things that stuck out to me was you talk about the perfect opening line and how to create tension and interest from the very beginning. And I remember that I was sitting in a seminar one time, and we were going around talking about some of our favorite first lines in a book. And people had different favorite first lines. And one of the guys stood up and he said, "I love this line, Mama died today." And it was 3 words. And it was like, I mean, talk about creating tension and interest from the very beginning. That hooks you in, right? So tell me about that.
Yes. What I teach writers is that the one thing that you have to know how to do in order to write a compelling hook for your book or your writing project, the first line of whatever you're writing has to get your reader to ask a question. And we actually do this somewhat intuitively. So not all the time, but like if you come to work on a Monday morning and you say something like, "You'll never guess what happened to me over the weekend," you're intuitively getting the listener to ask you a question. What? What happened? Tell me what happened. They have to know. Even that line that you mentioned, "Mama died today," the question that we're asking is, "Oh my God, how? What was that like for you? Tell me about that. Tell me more." We have to get really good at getting our reader or our listener to ask a question. You know, you talked about when you give a speech, your audience is only going to remember one thing, and it's going to be the stories. This is one of the reasons why I think learning to tell great stories is an issue of justice. Those of us who are the best at telling the stories in our culture, we will control the narrative. And I say that realizing like that puts a ton of power. If I say, well, I want to get good at telling stories so that I can control the narrative, that can have a negative connotation to it, controlling the narrative. But I want you to think about who's controlling the narrative right now. Like who's writing the history books? Who's writing the news? So if we want the world to be a more just place, we need more people to be better at telling stories, because stories are how we get human attention. Yeah. And when you have human attention, you get to deliver information that is important to you. And the information that's important to you is equally as important as the information that's important to your neighbor, but maybe you're better at telling a story, or maybe they're better at telling a story than you are. The one who's the best at telling the story is the one who's going to control the narrative. In my view, the more people who have access to this skill set, this ability to shape a narrative, the better, because then we get a contribution of information and storytelling from more than just one small subset of people. So I see this as a justice issue, not just as like a cool creative thing that we can do, although it is that, but also like this cool creative thing that we get to do is part of how we contribute to the broader conversation. And I think everybody deserves the chance to contribute.
Yes, absolutely true. Very good. Yes. You know, one of the things that a lot of people say to me is I struggle to sort of get in the zone. Now, you mentioned things like lighting a candle and, you know, creating a space, doing the jumping jacks. We know that's super important, you know, because body, mind, spirit. I mean, it's all intertwined, right? Like we have to stoke that, and we have to get all of that going. Are those the ways that you would suggest, best ways to boost that creativity in those writing sessions? What if someone has like just flat out writer's block? I mean, I'm sure you've experienced writer's block. What do you do? Because who says that quote where they say a writer is thinking, oh no, I'm not going to butcher it, but maybe you know it. It's something about what a writer is doing when they're looking out the window. A writer is doing their best work when they're looking out the window. I don't know, but all I can tell you, Allie, is I've looked out a mini window. So what happens like when you get writer's block? What do you do?
Yeah. Well, this is a double-edged sword because, yes, all the things that I mentioned before, I call it getting limbic, because what you're doing is dropping into your limbic system. The more that you can drop into the primal part of your brain, the easier it's going to be for you to get in the creative flow. And that's when our best ideas really come to us, right? When we're in the creative flow. The problem with that is there are all these tips and tricks and tactics that I could teach you that help you get in the creative flow. And they are very helpful. But there's no way to force yourself into the creative flow. By its very nature, the flow is the flow. So if you're not in the flow, you're not in the flow.
Yep.
So it's a little bit like, I'm struggling to fall asleep. I'm struggling to fall asleep. Well, the harder that you try to fall asleep, the more you think about falling asleep, the less likely you are to fall asleep. Sometimes the best way to fall asleep is to not try to fall asleep. It's to watch a show or get a book out or do something that is going to make you forget about how you should be sleeping right now, and to release that and surrender to it and just naturally fall asleep. And the same is true with writer's block. Sometimes the more we struggle against our writer's block, the more stuck we get inside of it. And so this is just a really interesting thing to think about. If you pay attention, again, to what's already working for you, for example, best ideas come to me in the shower.
Same.
In the car when I'm driving, when I'm folding laundry, when I'm brushing my teeth, because you're doing something that's a rote activity, which disengages your frontal cortex and gives your limbic system more chance to come to life. Our world, our culture is not set up in a way that celebrates the limbic. We celebrate frontal cortex. Frontal cortex is incredibly important. This is the higher evolved part of your brain. It's the part of your brain that helps you pay your bills on time, that helps you get to appointments on time, that helps you get straight A's in school, that helps you turn in your homework assignments, whatever. So we're all very well-trained individuals in frontal cortex. What we're not very well trained in is the creative part of our brain. And our frontal cortex and our limbic system will fight with each other if we try to. It's like having one foot on the gas pedal and one on the brake at the same time. If you're wanting to play with this a little bit, play with doing something that's more limbic. Play with doing an activity that's very rote for you. Maybe that's a sport. Like maybe you're a basketball player. And so when you're playing basketball, you're not really thinking, you're just doing. Maybe you're a musician. And so when you sit down to the piano, that's when, the ideas really come through for you. Or maybe it's the shower or the laundry or whatever. So you can play with some of those things to see if you can experiment with what it feels like to be limbic. At the same time, you can't force yourself into that space when it's not there. So I've gone through long seasons of my life where I'm just in a season of writer's block, and nothing that I do to force myself out of it really helps. It's just more bad writing that I'm going to throw out the next day.
That's so true.
So that's all part of it too.
Yeah, that's so true. And I would highly suggest, if you are going to try to practice what Ally's talking about, weave in about 30 extra minutes, like if you're going to be in the shower, because for me, I often get inspiration there too. And I'm like having to jump out, like type something on my phone, jump back in. I mean, literally it has happened like that, because otherwise I'll forget whatever I'm inspired by. Also, the treadmill often has been a place for me that I have gotten inspired. And that is because, like you're saying, it's a rote activity, and, you're working your body, but your mind is also able to get that blood flow. Yeah, it's amazing how this all works. But you are so right. It's like you can try to force it. It's just going to be a bunch of bad words you're going to end up throwing away. It is not worth it. So good.
Not worth it.
Well, one of the things that stood out in Write Your Story to me was this idea, which is a little bit off the path of writing and speaking, but I still think it's worth talking about, how to be the most interesting person in the room. I think that is really intriguing. Tell us about how we can do that.
I mean, this goes back to what I was saying before. It's like there's, on the one level, it's like, how do I be the most interesting person in the room so that I can get more job opportunities, so that, I'm not embarrassed when I stand up and tell a speech at my friend's wedding, so that I can go to a networking event and connect with other people who are like me and who will find me fascinating. So there's some element of it that's kind of surface level. That's all great too. But I think that there's also a deeper level running underneath of this, where there's a justice issue. It's like there are too many of us, and you talked about women. I think women are a big part of this story, where we have been trained and taught to put ourselves beneath, to make ourselves less important than, to assume that we're less interesting than the people around us. So the act of writing your story is about making yourself more interesting to other people. Sure. Yes. It's also about making you more interesting to you, about showing you the parts of your life that are truly so fascinating. Because think about the miracle that it is that any single one of us are here on this planet, living this life, breathing in and out. My dad suffered a massive heart attack a little over 8 years ago now, and almost died multiple times on the way to the hospital, and lived miraculously. And he wrote this essay after the experience that was called "Dying is Easy, It's Living That's the Hard Part." And when you think about like how easy it would be for any one of our organs to malfunction and for our life to be over in a heartbeat, it's just a reminder that it's an absolute miracle that we're sitting here having this conversation. Like, this is insane. And even the most mundane things that happen to us in a day are absolutely insane. And when we can see our lives for the miracle that they are, we're more engaged in them. We are more likely to contribute to the world around us, more likely to serve and give of our gifts. So yeah, we become greater contributors. We become more involved in our communities. We become more connected to the people around us. We have more joy and love in our lives. Like, everything gets better and radiates out from there when we see ourselves as interesting. And I believe when we see ourselves as interesting as we have always been. So if you don't see your life as interesting, my take is your life is endlessly fascinating. You just haven't had the vantage point to see how interesting it is yet. And the act of sitting down to write your story will give you that vantage point.
I also say it's such a gift to your family. You know, it's such a gift to people that love you, to know where you came from, what your experiences were. There's some things that come out, like when I'm talking to my mother and she'll say, this happened to me when I was younger or whatever. And so a couple Christmases ago, I gave her a book and I said, hey, on your own timetable, but eventually some Christmas from now, maybe in a year or 2 years, I want this back as my gift. I want you to write out your story for me. It is such a gift for our families to know who we were and to know what we felt and to know stories that we'll never otherwise know. And so do it as a gift to your family as well, would be my input on this. Well, I have loved having you on, Alli. Tell us one piece of advice maybe you would give for someone that is just saying, you know, I want to jump in, I want to write, but I just have not had the courage to do so. Maybe there's like a book in me that has been in there for like 10 years, but I just haven't really taken that step.
I would just say take the chance on yourself. You can start this process with no intention to ever share this with anybody. This book was really born from my personal experience of writing about my divorce many years ago. I was telling Alli this morning, I was like, it feels like an entire lifetime ago. But at the time when I was going through this divorce, it was a really, really dark time in my life. I felt like my entire world was falling apart. It wasn't just my marriage. My business was falling apart. My community was falling apart. Even like the faith of my upbringing, I was just like, I don't even know what I believe anymore. It was a very, very dark night of the soul. When I was in that time, I sat down to start writing about what was taking place in my life because it was the only thing that I knew to do to make sense of this, honestly. I didn't ever plan on sharing it with anyone. It was a complete mess. It was total chaos. So even if I had wanted to share it with someone at that point, I don't think anyone would have been interested to read it. But the act of putting my story on paper before I even did any editing or anything quite literally saved my life. It was the most profound thing that I've ever done and one of the most profound shifts I've ever experienced in my life. One of my friends the other day was just saying, like, he was like, you're savage. Like, think about what you went through and you transmuted that experience into this book that you now get to release into the world and to share with other people. So if someone's in that place where they don't see their life as interesting yet, or they sort of deep down do, but they'd be afraid to admit that to anyone, like, I know I have something to say, but I'm not sure what it is yet. My benediction to them would be just give yourself enough courage to get started. Just take the chance on yourself to just simply write down on the page what took place. What was it that happened? Tell that story as if you're telling a very close friend. And I hope that the book, Write Your Story, gives you a framework and some guidance to help you put some shape to that story so that you can begin to see your life from a different perspective. But even if you don't ever get to that place, even if all you're doing is just telling it how it happened, it's a very, very cathartic experience. And I know it's going to be transformational for anyone who tries it. So
yes. So good. Thank you so much for being with us, Ally Fallon, and get this book, Write Your Story, and really check out everything that she does. She's really got a great gift to offer the world in putting our words down on paper, and it is cathartic. Whether or not it ever goes anywhere, I am also a big believer in just getting it out, because there's something about that. So thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks for joining us on the Called Creatives podcast. Be sure to download your free book proposal template. You can go to calledcreatives.com/book-proposal. We created it just for you. So whether you're writing this for an agent or to organize your thoughts before you write, this template will help your book process be a huge success. We'll see you back here on the Called Creatives podcast.